Karen sneered at the Royal Guard's cross, convinced it was just a meaningless trinket. But the moment she ripped it from his neck, she realized too late why faith is more than just jewelry. Here's what happened. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guard James Miller stood at his post, a living statue in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. 8 years of military service, including 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, had earned him this prestigious position. At his neck hung a small silver cross, a gift from his mother before his first deployment. It had been with him through firefights and fallen comrades, a quiet reminder of faith that had sustained him through the worst moments of war. The usual crowd of tourists maintained a respectful distance, snapping photos and speaking in hushed tones. But the reverent atmosphere shattered as a sharp voice cut through the murmur. What a ridiculous waste of taxpayer money, standing around like mannequins all day. The crowd parted as Margaret Wilson, known simply as Karen, strode forward with the confident entitlement of someone who believed the world existed primarily for her convenience. Her expensive beige pantsuit and designer sunglasses screamed privilege, and her French manicure gleamed as she gestured dismissively at the guard. "Mom, please," her son David whispered, his tall frame hunched as if trying to disappear. "We're guests here. Let's just take a few photos and move on." Karen ignored him, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on Guard Miller. "Look at him, standing there like some kind of robot. Is this supposed to impress us?" she announced, loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. Her gaze sharpened as she noticed the silver cross at Miller's collar. Her mouth twisted into a sneer, years of bitter contempt for religion rising to the surface. "Oh, would you look at that?" she said, voice dripping with disdain. "Not just playing soldier, but pushing religion, too. How perfectly medieval." Guard Miller remained motionless, though behind his disciplined exterior his mind briefly registered the hostile tone. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to identify threats before they materialized. The woman's aggressive stance and targeted contempt set off the same warning signals he'd once felt on patrol in Helmand Province. Karen stepped closer than the informal boundary most tourists respected, her eyes fixed on the religious symbol with particular hostility. Ridiculous tradition, ridiculous uniform, and now ridiculous superstition, too, she muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is exactly what's wrong with the world today." David's face flushed with embarrassment as tourists began to stare. His mother's hatred for religion was about to create another public spectacle, and this time she'd chosen a target who couldn't walk away. Karen circled Guard Miller like a predator assessing its prey, her eyes repeatedly drawn to the silver cross at his neck. "You know what really bothers me about religion?" she announced to the growing audience. "It's how it infects everything, the military, education, politics. Can't escape it anywhere." She stepped directly in front of Miller, deliberately blocking tourists trying to take photos, especially when people in positions of authority flaunt it. David tried again to intervene. "Mom, that's his personal faith. It's not an official. It's superstitious nonsense is what it is." Karen cut him off, her voice rising. "And he's wearing it while in uniform. Completely inappropriate." She stepped even closer to Guard Miller, close enough that protocol would typically demand intervention. "Isn't there some rule against pushing your religious propaganda while on duty?" The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, his training holding firm despite the uncomfortable proximity. The cross caught the sunlight again, a brief flash of silver against scarlet. "What's the matter? Can't defend your little magical charm?" Karen taunted. "Or maybe you know it's all make-believe, just a security blanket for grown men scared of reality." A few tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances. A family with young children quietly moved away, the parents whispering something about finding a better angle. The atmosphere had shifted from admiration to unease. Behind his stoic expression, Miller's thoughts briefly drifted to when the cross had truly mattered most, in a dusty village outside Kandahar, when his unit was pinned down by enemy fire. 3 men wounded, radio damaged, ammunition running low. He'd gripped the cross in those desperate moments, finding clarity amid chaos. The silver had been slick with his sweat and blood then, but his mind had cleared enough to formulate the strategy that got everyone out alive. "I bet you don't even know why you wear it," Karen continued, unaware of the memories her target was reliving. "Just following the herd, right? That's what religion is, mindless obedience to fairy tales." David stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his mother's arm. "Mom, please. These guards are active-duty military. They deserve our respect, regardless of your views on religion." Respect. Karen laughed sharply, the sound cutting through the courtyard. "For standing around like store mannequins. For wearing symbols of oppression and control." She shook off her son's hand. "That cross represents centuries of violence and manipulation. It's not worthy of respect." Miller maintained his forward gaze, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The cross had been with him through 8 years of service, through firefights and loss, through moments when faith was the only thing that made sense in a world of chaos. Its meaning to him had nothing to do with the bitter woman's accusations. "You religious types are all the same," Karen proclaimed, addressing the guard as if he'd engaged in her one-sided debate. "Hiding behind symbols, too afraid to think for yourselves." She leaned closer, her voice lowering to a mock whisper that nonetheless carried to those nearby. "Is that why you joined the military? Looking for someone to tell you what to do, just like your church does?" Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably, the confrontation having crossed from tourist curiosity to something uglier. An American couple exchanged glances of embarrassment, the wife mouthing, "She's not with us," to a nearby British family. "Mom," David tried again, his voice strained. "This isn't a place for this discussion. He's doing his job. His job is to stand there and take it," Karen retorted, eyes still fixed on the guard's impassive face. "Just like he stands there and takes whatever nonsense his religion feeds him." She reached into her purse, pulling out her phone. "Maybe I should document this religious display on a government employee. I'm sure the internet would find it fascinating." The cross at Miller's neck seemed to catch the light again, as if responding to the attention focused upon it. His disciplined stillness continued, but something in his bearing had subtly changed the tension of a soldier assessing a threat rather than a guard enduring a tourist's rudeness. "You have no right to push your religious propaganda while in uniform," Karen declared, her voice growing louder as she sensed the discomfort of the crowd. Separation of church and state is clearly a foreign concept here. A middle-aged couple in the crowd exchanged glances, the woman wearing a discreet clerical collar beneath her jacket whispering something to her companion. On the opposite side, an elderly man with military bearing and a veteran's pin on his lapel watched with growing concern. "Some of us are trying to enjoy a cultural experience without religious nonsense intruding," Karen continued, playing to her reluctant audience. "But no, you people have to push your symbols everywhere." "Young lady," the elderly veteran stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen real conflict. "You might want to reconsider your approach. These men are serving soldiers, not props for your political statements." Kieran spun toward him, finding a new target. "Oh, look, another one. Let me guess you've got a cross hidden somewhere too. God and country, is that it?" "I served alongside men of every faith and none," the veteran replied evenly. "What I learned is that you respect a person's convictions, especially when they're willing to die defending your right to criticize them." The woman in the clerical collar approached, her expression concerned but composed. "Perhaps we could discuss comparative religion elsewhere. This young man is performing his duties, and interfering with the Queen's guard is actually an offense. Of course you defend him, Karen snapped, noting the collar. The religious always stick together, don't you? A cross, a collar, a crescent, all tools to control the masses. Davies. Mortification had transformed to genuine alarm. Mom, that's enough. We need to go now. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the confrontation. A tour guide was quietly explaining to her group that this behavior was highly inappropriate. Several phone cameras had appeared, though most were discreetly lowered. Few wanted to document someone's worst moment. You're all missing the point, Karen insisted, turning back to Guard Miller. These symbols aren't innocent. That cross represents centuries of oppression, crusades, inquisitions, colonization. That cross also represents compassion, sacrifice, and hope to billions. The clergywoman countered quietly, including many who wear that same uniform. False hope is worse than none, Karen retorted, stepping closer to the guard again. Her voice dropped to a dangerous level. And when you wear it like this, flaunting it while in uniform, you're pushing that false hope on everyone who sees you. The veteran had moved closer, recognizing escalation when he saw it. Ma'am, I strongly suggest you step back and respect the guard's space. He's a public display. That's the whole point. Karen's voice had taken on the shrill edge of someone committed to their position despite mounting opposition. Mom, please. David made one last desperate attempt. You've made your point. Let's go before. Kim, before what? Karen challenged, her eyes never leaving the cross at Miller's neck. Before someone actually stands up to this religious intimidation. That little trinket isn't special. It's not magical. It's just metal and mythology. Something in her expression shifted from righteous indignation to calculation. The veteran recognized it immediately, the look of someone about to cross a line deliberately. He took a step forward, but Karen was already moving. Time to prove it's just jewelry, she announced, her hand rising toward the guard's neck. Let's see if your faith is stronger than your silly rules about standing still. Time seemed to slow as Karen's hand moved through the air. Tourists gasped, several stepping back instinctively. The veteran lunged forward but was too far away to intervene in time. David called out, "Mom, stop," his voice cracking with panic. Karen's red lacquered nails were inches from the silver cross now, her face lit with the triumphant expression of someone about to prove their point. In her mind, she was striking a blow against centuries of religious oppression. In reality, she was about to assault a serving soldier. Guard. Miller's mind flashed to the day he'd received the cross his mother's hands, worn from years of hard work, pressing it into his palm before his first deployment. "To keep you safe," she'd said. Then, later, in Afghanistan, when Simon had died saving 3 of their unit, the chaplain had placed Simon's own cross in Miller's hand. "He would want you to have this," the chaplain had said. 2 crosses, merged into one, symbols of maternal love and brotherhood sacrifice. As Karen's fingers brushed against the chain, Miller could almost hear Simon's voice from that last firefight. "Faith isn't just what you believe, brother. It's what gives you strength when nothing else remains." The cross represented everything that had carried him through the darkest moments of combat, not just religious conviction, but the faith in something greater than himself. The faith that had given him courage when bullets flew past his head. The faith that had steadied his hands as he applied pressure to a fellow soldier's wounds. The faith that had helped him stand tall at military funerals, honoring those who wouldn't come home. Karen's fingertips touched the silver metal, her expression triumphant as she prepared to yank the necklace from his neck. "See, just a piece of jewelry." The veteran saw it coming and braced himself. The clergywoman winced, already anticipating the aftermath. David covered his eyes, unable to watch the inevitable. In Karen's mind, the next moment would unfold in one of 2 ways. Either the guard would remain motionless as she removed his silly trinket, proving her point about meaningless symbols, or he would break protocol to stop her, proving her point about religious zealotry overriding duty. Either way, she would win. What she hadn't counted on was the third option, that a decorated combat veteran might have reflexes and training that transcended ceremonial duties. Her fingers had just closed around the cross when Gart Miller's white-gloved hand moved with the precision and speed that had once cleared buildings in hostile territory. One moment, he was the perfect statue. The next, his hand had captured her wrist in midair, halting her motion with a grip that was firm but controlled, the same calculated force he'd once used to restrain enemy combatants without causing unnecessary harm. The courtyard fell absolutely silent. Even the birds seemed to pause in mid-song. Karen's mouth opened in shock, her self-righteous expression freezing into one of disbelief. The cross remained exactly where it was, catching the late afternoon sun as if nothing had happened. He moved. Someone whispered from the crowd, the words carrying in the sudden silence. Cray, for 8 years of service, 4 of them as a Queen's Guard Miller, had never broken protocol. He had stood motionless through rain and heat, through tourist pranks and childish provocations. He had maintained perfect composure as people made faces, told jokes, and attempted to startle him. But this was different. This wasn't about the uniform or the rules. This was about something far more personal, far more sacred. His eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance throughout Karen's tirade, now shifted to meet hers directly. In that gaze was not anger, not hatred, but something far more unsettling, the calm, focused intensity of a warrior who had faced real battles, not merely ideological ones. "Ma'am," Miller spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in combat situations, "you will not touch this cross." The shock that rippled through the crowd was almost palpable. Karen's expression transformed from triumph to outrage, her free hand rising as if to slap the guard. But something in Miller's eyes, that same steady intensity that had once stared down armed insurgents, made her hesitate. "How dare you?" she sputtered, attempting to pull her wrist free from his grip. "Take your hands off me. This is assault." Miller's grip neither tightened nor loosened, perfectly calibrated just as his training had taught him. When he spoke again, his voice remained measured, carrying easily across the now sealant courtyard. "What you attempted was assault, ma'am. Interference with the Queen's Guard is a criminal offense." His eyes never left hers, unblinking and direct. "But that's not why I stopped you." He released her wrist with the same controlled precision with which he'd caught it, the movement so smooth it seemed almost part of a ceremonial routine. Rather than immediately resuming his post, however, he squared his shoulders and addressed not just Karen but the entire gathering. "This cross," he said, touching the silver symbol at his neck with white-gloved fingers, "is not government issue. It's not part of this uniform, and it's not a statement about anyone else's beliefs or lack thereof." The gathered tourists, who had been holding their collective breath, remained completely silent. Even Karen seemed momentarily at a loss for words, rubbing her wrist, though Miller's grip had been firm but not painful. "Cross. This cross was a gift from my mother before my first deployment to Afghanistan," Miller continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience far beyond his years. 8 years ago, I watched it catch the sunlight, just like this, as our transport plane took off. I didn't know then that 3 men from that flight wouldn't return home." Several tourists lowered their heads respectfully. The veteran in the crowd stood straighter, recognizing the unspoken brotherhood between soldiers past and present. 4 months into that deployment, my best friend Simon threw himself on an improvised explosive device to save 3 of our unit. When they recovered his body, they found his own cross-bent, but intact. The chaplain gave it to me, knowing what mine meant to me. I had both crosses melded into one, a reminder of sacrifice, of brotherhood, of faith in something greater than ourselves. Karen opened her mouth to interject, but David placed a restraining hand on her arm, his expression pleading for her silence. For once she complied. "You call this just jewelry," Miller continued, his eyes meeting Karen's directly. "To you, perhaps that's all it is. But to me, it's 8 years of service. It's the faces of friends who didn't come home. It's the strength I found when we were pinned down under enemy fire with no extraction in sight. It's the hope that kept me going through rehabilitation after taking shrapnel in my left leg." Key gestured toward the palace behind him. "This uniform represents my duty to crown and country, but this cross, this represents what sustained me through the moments when duty alone wasn't enough." The clergywoman nodded slightly, understanding evident in her expression. The veteran touched his own medals in silent recognition of shared experience. "I respect your right to believe, must believe," Miller said, his voice neither defensive nor aggressive. "That same freedom is among the principles I swore to defend. But that freedom doesn't give you the right to assault someone for wearing a symbol of their faith, whether that person is in uniform or not." Key straightened to his full height, the afternoon sun casting his shadow long across the courtyard stones. Freedom of religion and freedom from religion are two sides of the same principle. They both require respect for boundaries. Karen's face had gone from outrage to something more complex, not quite contrition, but perhaps the first seeds of doubt in her absolute righteousness. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then found her voice. "You've just violated your duty for a religious symbol," she said, though her usual venom had diminished. "That proves my point about how religion corrupts professional obligations." Miller's reply came without hesitation. "Ma'am, my duty includes preventing assault on any member of the Queen's Guard. I merely fulfilled that duty while explaining why your actions were particularly misguided." A hint of something, not quite a smile, but a subtle shift in his expression crossed his face. "Now, I would respectfully suggest you step back to the appropriate viewing distance. Palace security is already on their way." As if on cue, 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, moving with purposeful strides toward the confrontation. "Before you're escorted away," Miller said, his voice calm but authoritative, "there's something you should understand about this cross and what it represents to those who serve." The security officers slowed their approach, sensing an important moment unfolding. The veteran nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging Miller to continue. "In Helmand Province, during my second tour, our unit was pinned down for 17 hours, no air support, limited ammunition, 3 men wounded." Miller's voice remained steady but carried the weight of lived experience. "When situations turn that desperate, you discover what truly matters, what gives you strength when everything else fails." Karen's defensive posture hadn't changed, but her expression had a reluctant recognition that she was hearing something authentic, not rehearsed. "For some of my unit, it was photos of their children. For others, remembering their oath. For me, it was this." He touched the cross again. "Not because I believed it had magical powers, but because it connected me to something beyond that moment of fear and uncertainty. It reminded me that throughout history, others had endured worse and found the courage to continue." The clergywoman stepped forward slightly. "Faith serves different purposes for different people," she offered. "For some, it's a moral compass. For others, a source of community. For many soldiers, it's a wellspring of courage." "Skilly," Miller nodded. "In combat, I served alongside Christians, Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, atheists, and agnostics. We never debated whose beliefs were superior. We respected that each person found their strength where they could, because when bullets are flying, philosophical debates become meaningless." "This cross," Miller continued, Reminds me of the chaplain who held the hands of dying men, offering comfort regardless of their faith. It reminds me of the Muslim soldier who gave his water ration to a wounded Christian. It reminds me that faith, at its best, isn't about judgment or superiority. It's about finding light in darkness. The veteran approached, standing beside Miller with the solidarity of shared experience. "I wore a similar cross in Vietnam," he said, addressing Karen directly. "Next to me, my best friend wore a Star of David. The man to my left had a small Buddha. We understood they represented the best parts of humanity when surrounded by the worst." Miller glanced around at the gathered crowd. "These ceremonial duties we performed are not meant to separate us from the public. They represent the connection between military service and the society we protect. We stand guard not just over buildings, but over the values that define a free society, including the freedom to believe or not believe." "You have every right to your opinions about religion," Miller concluded. "You have every right to express those opinions. What you don't have is the right to physically impose those opinions on others, whether by attempting to remove religious symbols or by forcing them on someone who doesn't want them." The security officers had reached them now, flanking Karen with professional detachment. "The irony, ma'am," Miller said as he prepared to resume his post, "is that the very freedom that allows you to criticize religion is the same freedom that protects religious expression. I've spent 8 years defending both, sometimes at great cost. I would do so again without hesitation, because a society that protects only popular expression isn't free at all." With that final statement, Miller returned to his ceremonial stance forward. Posture perfect, the living embodiment of discipline and duty. "This is outrageous." Karen's voice had regained its shrill edge as security officers approached. He put his hands on me. "That's the real assault." The senior officer, a woman with a weathered expression, responded calmly. "Ma'am, attempting to touch a Queen's Guard or their uniform is prohibited by law. We have multiple witnesses who observed your actions. It wasn't personal property. It was religious propaganda on a government uniform," Karen insisted, looking around for support but finding none. David stepped forward, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "Officers, I apologize for my mother's behavior. We accept responsibility." "I accept nothing," Karen snapped. "This entire situation is a violation of the separation of church and state." "Ma'am," the male officer explained patiently, "you're in the United Kingdom. Attempting to remove anything from a Queen's Guard is an offense under the Protection of Military Remains Act." The female officer added, "You have 2 options: formal charges or leave immediately with a warning." David quickly interjected, "We'll take the warning and leave." He turned, pleading eyes to his mother. "Mom, please. This isn't worth spending the night in a British jail cell." After a moment's hesitation, Karen conceded with poor grace, "Fine, but I'll be filing complaints about this religious persecution." As they were escorted away, Karen's protests continued, but with diminishing conviction. Just before they reached the gates, she glanced back at Guard Miller, now resumed at his post. For the briefest moment, something like uncertainty crossed her face, not conversion or contrition, but perhaps the first crack in her absolute certainty. The cross at Miller's neck caught the sunlight one final time before Karen was ushered through the gates and out of sight. What would you have done in Guard Miller's position? Would you have broken protocol to protect something meaningful to you, or maintained your duty regardless of personal cost? We often judge others' symbols and beliefs without understanding their deepest significance. When was the last time you took a moment to learn what someone else's faith means to them, rather than assuming your interpretation is correct? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more powerful stories of tradition and respect. Share this with someone who might need this reminder about the personal meaning behind public symbols. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now to discover more inspiring stories of honor and service. And we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video.